Hi, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing the relationships in the Americas, in North America primarily, with Native Americans, with a little bit of comparison with Mexico to give some idea of how different race relations developed in different countries. Imagine for a second, you live in a small village near the sea. You're part of a kingdom, maybe of several 100,000, maybe millions of people. One day a few strange boats appear that look like they're pulled by clouds. Several hundred dirty and bedraggled people come off the boats looking like beggars. They have strange ornaments, hard tools you've never seen, sticks that kill game at a distance. Who are these strange people? How should you react? Are they gods cast off from a far-off land? They don't seem much of a threat, and they only ask for a small piece of land that no one wants in the swamp. Why not let them stay? Well, this was the situation facing many Native Americans between 400 and 500 years ago, and maybe they made a mistake. Now, there's a vast difference between the experience of interaction between Spanish and English settlers in America, so I want to give some comparison. So, for example, in the Caribbean was the area specifically discovered by Christopher Columbus, as we know him in America, in 1492. As you probably know, he thought he was going to India, and he thought he discovered India. Most people at the time thought he was a fool, not because they thought the world was flat, but because they knew that India was a long, long way away, and the boats would never be able to get all the way to India across from the Atlantic all the way across to where India lay. But he went ahead anyway, and luckily for him, he discovered America. Until he died, however, he still thought he had found a new route to India. But very rapidly, what happened in the colonies he discovered, not that he himself had a lot to do with it, but because of people coming after him, is disease, first of all, and secondly, enslavement of the natives led to the extermination of almost the entire population. So almost all the natives living in the Caribbean islands were killed off by a combination of these factors. Now, as a result, to its credit, one of the results of this was that the Spanish reconsidered some of their colonial policies. And one thing they did is they abolished outright the enslavement of natives in the Americas. However, they substituted other policies that were equally as brutal, such as the encomienda system, in which Spaniards were given the right to take over native villages more or less in feudalistic lines in order to civilize the Indians. But very often the techniques they used were very brutal and really not that much different from slavery. But as the population was eliminated, Spaniards soon sought to turn to importing slaves from Africa to their new plantations. So the Spanish may have abolished the slavery of Native Americans, but they didn't say anything about Africans. So they used Africans as slaves. Mexico was the next stage of conquest of the Spanish. And the history of the conquest of Mexico is kind of interesting in many different ways. First of all, Hernán Cortés, who was the person who led the conquest of Mexico, was actually a very minor Spanish noble who talked his way into the courts in the colonies in Cuba. At the time was the colonial head of the Spanish colony in the Caribbean. And technically speaking, he convinced them to let him lead a mission to Mexico for trade and in research purposes only. He was just supposed to investigate. He wasn't supposed to do anything else. But as soon as he left, they thought twice and said, no, we don't want this guy going. He's too crazy. So they tried to stop him. They even sent an arrest warrant after him and a group of troops to stop him. But Hernan Cortez seemed to be very, very persuasive. Every time they sent somebody after him, he managed to persuade them to join him in his expedition. So literally, Hernan Cortez landed in Veracruz, Mexico, with 500 men and 13 horses on what was technically an illegal mission. With nowhere to go, if he went back to Cuba, he'd be arrested. He could only go forward. So working with local allies or talking to local allies, one by one, he persuaded them to join him. He managed to get them, many of them, on his side against, at that time, the central empire of Mexico was called the Aztec Empire, which you may have heard of. The Aztec Empire was centered in what is today Mexico City, at that time called Tenochtitlan. And with the help of his allies, and not without some setbacks along the way, he was literally able to conquer the Aztec Empire, which was an empire in population larger at that time than any country in Europe, with a capital city larger than any city in Europe. The wealth sent back to Spain as a result of this conquest was so great, it disrupted the entire European economy. So much gold and silver flooded the market that inflation basically created a huge collapse in many economies. Spain was turned into a powerhouse, but only temporarily. A lot of the economic development itself happened in England and Holland and helped spur the Industrial Revolution and changed our history forever. Now, the Spanish, you have to realize, encountered an advanced and very wealthy culture in Mexico, and this may have reduced substantially their negative stereotypes about the local population. There was only one thing they didn't like, which was the practice of human sacrifice. Other than that, they were generally quite impressed with the native skills in combat, their local cultures, their history, and their marketplaces, their economy, even the way they laid out their cities. The Aztec capital, for example, Tenochtitlan, was built on a lake in a series of man-created islands and was larger and cleaner than any comparable European city of the time. Now, there are some big differences, as we can see. When the Spanish came to Mexico, they came as conquerors, not as colonists. Their idea was not to establish a colony of Europeans. It was to establish dominance over the native populations, very similar to traditional practices of conquest in Europe. So, for example, when the Normans conquered England, they didn't just take a small portion of England. They established their control over all of England by placing their knights and nobles in key positions throughout the English countryside. And like the Normans, they didn't necessarily see the natives as necessarily an inferior race. Rather, they took position over them, and but at the same time, there were still many native lords and princes. So up until 200 years after the conquest of Mexico, there was still a Mexican emperor who was at least recognized in that title, although of course they didn't have any real power. Now, another feature of the conquest of Mexico, in fact, all of the Americas, was that the native population was not immune. They had not faced many of the diseases that had racked Europe over the previous period of time. So all of these diseases came up and one by one wiped out tons, decimated, one could say, the Native American population. Not just one decimation, but a series of decimations. So it's estimated the population of the entire Americas was reduced by maybe up to 80% or more, simply due to disease. Now, Spanish policies of not exactly enslavement, but essentially forced feudalism in their colonies in Mexico didn't help. It reduced the amount of food available, as well as the fact that that level of disruption of the population really disrupted the social structure of the native populations. So many of the old empires simply collapsed on their own, the kingdoms collapsed, and most of the native population collapsed into village-level societies, and didn't really recover for many, many generations. But in this process, even though, of course, initially and throughout the colonial period, Spaniards were considered superior, still there was the growth of a large mixed population of Spanish and indigenous children, mixed children, but also not just genetically, but also culturally mixed. So many natives became culturally Hispanicized. They adopted the Catholic religion for the most part, and most natives adopted Spanish as their first language. So Mexico, for example, became a mestizo country, became a country that identified itself not as Spanish, but rather as primarily indigenous. And so, for example, even the name Mexico is a reference to the Aztecs, who were also called the Mexica. So Mexico named itself after the Mexica as opposed to naming themselves after Spain, for example. However, as I said, they did adopt the dominant language Spanish, Catholicism the dominant religion. However, with an interesting note that the Virgin of Mexico, the equivalent of Virgin Mary, is the Virgin of Guadalupe, which many people believe is a representation of the mother of the Aztec gods. So there was a transfusion or emergence of the Aztec religion with the Spanish Catholic religion. Even today, purely indigenous tribes still represent a substantial portion of Mexico's population, about 30 to 40%. However, they do tend to live in the more marginalized areas because these are the areas where they were able to maintain and survive in terms of their cultural integrity. So Mexico has a very different history than the U.S., and while repression was very brutal there, in a way it created a composite culture between the indigenous and Hispanic elements that continues to this day. Now, North America had a very different history for a number of reasons. When the British began colonizing America, first of all, it was much more inauspicious. Their first colony at Roanoke disappeared after a year. Whether the people died, they may have died of starvation, possibly they fled and became adopted or absorbed into the native tribes in the area. Or maybe they were just attacked and killed off. Nobody knows because they disappeared. But the first permanent settlement was in Jamestown in 1607. About a decade later, the famous Puritan settlement in Boston or Massachusetts Bay was set up. But in a very different relationship than the Spanish, the English were not at all interested in establishing dominance over the Native Americans. They just wanted land. They wanted a piece of land. To some extent, yes, they wanted to trade with the natives. They wanted to find resources in the Americas, but they didn't want to do that necessarily by establishing permanent relationships with the native tribes. Now, there were impressive cities in the North American region. Some, for example, Cahokia in the Midwest contained maybe several 100,000 citizens. It had pyramids and temples, somewhat similar to the temples of Mesoamerica, where the Aztecs were. But they never quite reached the same levels of development, and they died out mysteriously again shortly before Europeans arrived. It's possible they died out again because of the same waves of disease emanating from Central America where the Spanish were arriving. But nobody again is 100% sure what destroyed these societies. It could have been natural causes or floods or droughts. So one of the results of this is that all the English saw were relatively undeveloped natives, who they thought of as wild and backward. These people lived, many of them were nomadic or semi-nomadic. Actually, in the northeast areas, quite a few were settled, but they didn't have stone houses. They had wood houses. They tended to still move around. They had what you might call horticultural agriculture, where they would live in one place for a year or two. And of course, many of the other Indians were nomadic. So the English were not terribly impressed with them. They thought of them as backward, wild, weak, although sometimes they thought of them as noble savages. So that also was another type of stereotype which kind of mixed some positive with negative aspects of the Native American stereotype. So, as I said before, the British strategy or goal was to colonize areas that they could send English people to and take over and basically develop as a direct extension of England. They were not really interested in conquering the native people. And in some sense, in the beginning, in most of the areas, relationships were negotiated as opposed to becoming a product of war. Many natives even agreed or assisted and helped the newcomers. So if you've seen the story of Pocahontas, obviously it's a somewhat idealized story, but the reality is that there was some friendly relationship at least initially, although of course there was also suspicion, etc. But the problem was this: the natives might have agreed, okay, a couple hundred strange people come in and we'll let them settle and eventually maybe they'll become a part of us. This was quite normal in Native American culture, to accept groups that didn't seem to be threatening and let them absorb into the group. The Europeans certainly brought some interesting technology, guns, which became very rapidly treasured by the natives. Horses, of course, also had a huge impact on Native American culture, another European import. But this was the problem. The Europeans didn't stop coming. They kept coming, and they kept coming. And at no point did they ever seem willing, except in the case of maybe one or two people, to adapt or adopt into the native culture. So while at first the natives might have said, okay, we'll let you in, you're obviously poor and impoverished, you need help. But after a while, it's like, what are these people? They keep coming, and they not only keep coming, they bring more guns, they come stronger than ever, and essentially the Native Americans reacted by striking back. The first revolt, there was a revolt of natives, or you could call it uprising. Technically speaking, it wasn't uprising, it was a reaction by the natives. Also, the Puritans also had to fight a war with the local natives. But the British, again, in each case, when they conquered or they defeated the natives, they weren't interested in taking the natives as a subject population. They simply wanted them out of the way. They wanted their land, not them. Now, I'm going to skip over a lot of history and relations. Obviously, over time, this process repeated itself, basically alternating between warfare with natives and trade. Native American societies went through a number of transformations at the time. But But I'm going to skip to the French-Indian Wars, which is 1754 to 1763. And this was a war between the French. It was going on in Europe between France and England. But in the Americas, it was between the Quebec area, or Canada at that time, which was colonized by the French, and the American, or what we now think of as the United States colonies, which were colonized by England. So English obviously they each saw each other as a threat, because the French and the English were constantly at war in Europe. But in the colonies, the Americans, or at least the English rather, called it the French-Indian Wars, because the French had relationships or allies among some of the Indian tribes. Now, the English also had allies, so both of them used Indian allies to fight proxy wars and to conduct raids against the enemy populations. So the French would encourage native tribes to attack English settlements, particularly ones that were out beyond the established frontier, and vice versa. The English would encourage their native allies to attack French colonies, and a lot of atrocities that were then attributed to Indians were really happening because they were encouraged by the various European masters. One of the results, of course, as you probably know, is that England won the war and took over Canada. The French population were respected as allowed to stay, and their rights were maintained. So the French were accepted, and the English also made a number of promises to Native American tribes. One of these is that they would not cross the Appalachians mountains. The Appalachian Mountains are basically West Virginia, eastern Pennsylvania. So essentially they were agreeing to stay on the coast and not to invade further into Indian territory. Now, this was a promise. It's unclear whether the British ever meant to stand by this promise, or it was just a temporary promise in order to keep the natives satisfied or calm for the while. The British at the time were rather upset about the cost of the war in the Americas. The war had been very costly for the expensive, and they wanted the colonists, the British colonists living in America, they wanted them to help pay for the war, right? The expense of all the soldiers going over from England and things like that. So they imposed a number of taxes and duties on the English. Well, the combination of these two things, one saying to American settlers, you can't go beyond the Appalachians, which was only 400 miles in, and the Americans wanted to expand. That was why they came to America, right? And then you had all these taxes and stamp tax and other taxes put on the Americans. These combined to basically create what we now know, or now call, the American Revolution of Independence, beginning in 1775 to 1776. So the America became independent in part because, or in large part because of these wars and agreements with Native American tribes. Now, when America became independent, it was no longer tied to this British promise of stopping at the Appalachians. And in fact, of course, America, as we all know, followed a very aggressive policy of moving into the hinterlands. And this was helped, of course, by the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France, and by other agreements after, for example, the War of 1812 with Great Britain that cleared up the boundaries between Canada and the United States. Later, there was the war with Mexico, which we'll discuss later. All of these opened up vast amounts of territory that was essentially unpopulated by Europeans. It was, however, populated by Native Americans. But the United States didn't seem to recognize them as a legitimate claimant to the land. So put it this way, the United States, on the one hand, recognized Native Americans as foreigners. They members of foreign tribes. But these tribes were never really recognized as nations. Right? The United States did not have ambassadors with the various Native American tribes. We had ambassadors in London and France. Right? So ambassador meant we recognize your country as a country on the same level as ours. Right? So the fact that they never had ambassadors to the Native American tribes, instead we had a Bureau of Indian Affairs, meant that we treated Native Americans we treated them as foreigners, but without sovereignty, without recognizing their nationality, their sense of statehood, or anything of that matter. Now, partly that was because the Native American tribes didn't have those types of beliefs either. They organized themselves in other ways. But the result was the relationships between the United States and Native American tribes were very uneven. The United States had a powerful army, even though it wasn't big. It certainly had a large military. On the other hand, the Native American tribes were often divided against each other, fighting against each other. So at any one time, the United States was usually able to dominate militarily over Native American tribes. And again, up until the 1880s, the U.S. policy was to exclude Native Americans by putting them on what were called reservations. So the reservation was supposed to be territory that was reserved for a particular tribe, and it was considered a territory of the United States. So the tribe was considered inside the United States, but not of the United States. Right? So all of these things combine to, on the one hand, subordinate Native Americans, but on the other hand, radically exclude them. So they weren't even segregated. Segregation meant that they lived separately, but they joined economically. They were completely excluded. And some of these were quite brutal. For example, the 1830 Removal Act took Native American tribes that lived in areas of Georgia and other areas of the South that were very, very wealthy, rich agricultural land that white people wanted to use for slave production, for producing slave crops like cotton and tobacco. And in these areas, the tribes had organized their own courts, their own system of judiciary, their own legislature. They had modeled a country after the United States of America. They were called so-called civilized tribes. But this made no difference. Andrew Jackson, as president, had them removed to what was then called Indian Territory, which is now called Oklahoma. Thousands and thousands of people died in the process because they were forced to walk 1,000 miles, basically. They lost their property, they lost their development, or many elements of their development. And then when the United States started to assimilate Native Americans, they did so again in a way that tended to weaken tribal structure. So, for example, in 1876, the Dawes Act forced Native American tribes to divide up their territory into individual allotments, so that every individual Indian would have their own land. But that was not the way most Indians lived. Most Indians lived as a community, working together, and they didn't even know how to farm individual pieces of land for the most part. That wasn't the way they worked, right? But in this allotment policy, they said, okay, every Indian gets 160 acres. That's a lot of land. But the people doing the allotment were white surveyors. And what they would do is they would allot the poorest land to the Indians, and then they would leave open all the excess land, the best land. And since they knew where that land was, they would get them or their buddies to buy it up. So the result is Native American tribes lost about half their territory, because anything outside the 160 allotment per Indian was considered excess and was sold off. And like I said, it was typically sold off in a semi-corrupt fashion that allowed a few white people to make massive amounts of money by buying a lot of this land really cheap and then turning it around and selling it very expensively. In theory, until the 1920s, Native Americans were still considered foreigners. There was a Supreme Court decision in Elk versus Wilkins in 1884 where a Native American sued for the right to vote, and the Supreme Court decided he couldn't vote. And the Native American said, this is from the text, he said, "I have surrendered myself to the United States, and I am now a United States citizen." And the Supreme Court literally said, yes, you surrendered, but did we accept your surrender? No. In other words, the United States court said in 1884, you may have surrendered, but that didn't mean we took you in. You're still excluded. And that law was maintained until the 1920s, when Native Americans were finally considered citizens of the United States. Now, in theory, Native Americans have additional rights because they're citizens of the United States and also of their own tribes. And several of the tribes, or many of the tribes, do collect royalties from lands and things like that. But in reality, these benefits are very small. A few Native American tribes are well off. Most are in very poor shape, and individual indicators, social indicators, death rates, alcoholism, depression, suicide rates among Native Americans are among the highest in the United States. So thank you for joining the lecture. I apologize. Obviously, there's not a lot of information we give in a single lecture. There's obviously a lot more you can learn about Native Americans. So please read the companion for other issues and for suggestions of other readings if you're interested in learning more about the history of Native Americans in the United States. Thank you.